Hey, what's up, Compass students? How you doing? Happy Wednesday. It's a beautiful day outside. I'm super excited about tonight and getting to hang out with you guys tonight at 6:30 for our student services online, and then to get to see you guys in our small group time. Hey, so today we're talking about grace, and grace is something that we talk about a lot because that's a gift that God gives us. It's part of the good news of the gospel that God gives us grace. Jesus gives us grace, and we have salvation because of His grace. But grace is also something that's a continual thing. It's something that we need every single day. It's something that we need to receive. It's something that we need to give. But what exactly does it mean to get grace? What exactly does it mean to give grace? And what areas do we need grace in? I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind, obviously, is I need grace for salvation. I need grace for my sin, to be able to have a right relationship with Jesus. He gives us that grace so that we can do that. But what other areas, as grace continues on, because it's a perpetual thing in our lives, what areas do we need grace in? And how does that work? I really love this verse, a couple verses in the book of 2 Corinthians. The Apostle Paul writes to a church in Corinth, and in chapter 12, verses 9 and 10, he says this. But he said to me, speaking of God talking to him, to the Apostle Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with my weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." That's just a really cool section of scripture, because God is telling Paul, like, hey, my grace is sufficient for you. And you got to remember, like, Paul wrote a lot of letters, a lot of the stuff. He went through a lot of hardships, but he wrote a lot of the letters to the churches from prison, from a prison cell. And he was in bondage and just in chains and chained up to somebody else. And he was beaten, and there were so many hardships that Paul had. So for him to say that God's grace is sufficient for him, like, that's super powerful. And I think about that and like, okay, what ways can this verse apply to me? Like, he says that he's content with his weaknesses, with insults, with hardships, with persecutions and calamities. For when we receive God's grace, when we surrender in our weaknesses, then the power of God, we really see that take over. And so that's my question today. And when we read this, I'm asking myself this, and I ask you the same question. What area are you weak in that you need the power of God's grace to step in and take over? What area have you been insulted in that you need the power of God's grace to step in and take over? What hardships are you going through? What calamities? Like, it's not hard to read this verse and apply what's going on right now with COVID-19 and the global pandemic that we're in, with being in quarantine, not being able to be around people. Maybe you have known someone that has the virus, or maybe you yourself have it. Like, that's a hardship, right? That's a calamity. Those are definitely things that are beyond our control. Those are definitely things that we are weak to be able to defend. But God's power can step in and take hold of those things. So I want you to think about that as you read this verse. Again, 2 Corinthians 12, 9 and 10. And as you read through where he talks about God's strength in his weaknesses. And he says, "For when I am weak, then I am strong." What are the weaknesses in your life that you need God's grace and the power of God's grace to come in and change your life? What are those areas? I want you to take those areas, like, you can write them down, or if you know them in your head, and just pray to God and just ask him to step in those areas where you're weak, and that his power and his grace would be enough for you. That his power and his grace would help you get through those things. I'm super excited about what God is doing. It's an entirely new world that we're in right now with social distancing and quarantining, and we don't know what it's going to look like once we're out of this. But what I do know is that God's grace and his power is sufficient for us now. It was sufficient for us before this happened. It's sufficient for us now. And it will be sufficient enough for us in whatever happens after this. I love you guys. I'll see you tonight at 6:30 for our student programming, and then I'll see you tomorrow at 1 o'clock for more one-on-one at 1. See ya.